Which one more? Okay. So I want you, while I'm speaking and after you walk away from here, to think about what shall we do? And really what I mean is, what shall you do? What is worth doing in light of the terminal diagnosis we have all received? And we've all received a terminal diagnosis. It came at birth. Birth is a sexually transmitted disease that is proven fatal in every case. So we know we're going to die. As Stephen Jenkinson says, everybody knows everybody else is going to die. But we act as if it's not going to affect us as individuals. So I know everybody's going to die. I'm not so sure about me. But if we really think about it, obviously we know that about our own death. And so we might want to focus on what matters most to us and spend time doing that. I am not now, nor have I ever promoted inaction in light of this predicament that I will talk about. Rather, I agree with Edward Abbey that sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. Or action is the antidote to despair, as he said elsewhere. I frequently hear that this message debilitates people, and particularly I should not be telling it to young people. Contrary to that message, I received this message from Serena Raphael in Western Australia. She's 25 years old. She's a millennial. She's not representing all millennials, obviously, nor does she intend to. But she is one person who has clearly come to grips with the situation and thanks me for telling her, reminding her of her terminal diagnosis. She also makes an important point beyond living without fear, without worry, without hope for the future. She takes action every day that she believes is right action, and she's not particularly attached to the outcome of those actions. And she also points out something really important, that the baby boomer generation, that's mine, and the other generations before hers have got to stop dumping the solution on her generation. She hears this in her college classes, and it drives her to despair. We have created a mess of the planet, and we expect the millennials to fix it, while we're living large. BYOB. I want to talk a little bit about me so that you can rest assured that I might actually know something about what I'm talking about, no matter how little. I didn't even know that I was talking about anything particularly important. I knew I was radicalized young, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly, but I didn't know until last year, about a year ago, when I received a message from an NSA contracted spy that I'd been surveilled since my 6th year in the college classroom, and that I'd had an NSA contracted spy in my classroom for the last several years I was teaching. And that was apparently because I was promoting and modeling anarchism in my classrooms, not because I was talking about abrupt climate change. In fact, my ability to connect the dots on abrupt climate change is probably the reason I'm alive today, according to this particular NSA-sponsored spy, who told me all this stuff after he retired. Or maybe he didn't retire. Do those guys ever get to retire? I'm not sure. So I encourage you to take this information, along with all information you receive, with a grain of salt. Now, he does point out that the Jason group, the people who actually are the smartest guys in the room, in the Pentagon, are conducting an analysis to be released later this year, indicating that Earth is not going to go Venus with a really heavy atmosphere. Rather, the atmosphere of Earth is likely to be stripped away as the world's nuclear power plants melt down, sending ionizing radiation into the atmosphere, and so that the Earth will be atmosphere-free for all practical purposes by 2054, which is not long from now. This is important to recognize because when people tell me that the so-called elite are going to escape Earth and go to Mars, I wonder why. We're turning this place into Mars. Hang around. Save you the trip. It's a long way from here to Mars. More about me. Arguably my favorite subject. It was early January 2007, my new department head, who I helped hire into the department, was a longtime friend of mine. We had known each other for many years. She was a mentor in my early days, in part because we both took teaching so seriously. She is a few years older than me, and we took teaching very, very seriously, and that's what brought us together on the campus of a major research university that gave most of its kudos to faculty members for their research, not for their teaching. So I was ecstatic when Lisa was hired, and her first administrative action was to schedule a meeting with me in early January 2007. We hugged as I walked in the door, and then she sits me down and she says, one of the few obligations, responsibilities of a department head is to decide who teaches what classes. And I have decided that you are not going to teach any in this department anymore. As a teacher, this was somewhat of a surprise to me. Sounds like the party's out there. I doubt this was because I wasn't a good teacher. Rather, a few years earlier, I had been acknowledged by one of the two transdisciplinary colleges at the University of Arizona that I would be awarded their highest recognition. One of two faculty members so acknowledged that year, and two faculty members acknowledged each year for the Teaching and Mentoring Award granted by the University of Arizona Graduate College. And a few years later, in my last year on campus, the other transdisciplinary college at the University of Arizona, the Honors College, similarly acknowledged me for my teaching. So I don't think it was because I was a particularly poor teacher. In fact, I'm one of the few people in history to be awarded full professorship before the age of 40. And I suspect I'm the only person at the University of Arizona to receive these three awards, the highest recognition in the three colleges in which I had any level of service. I think rather that the attraction from the NSA and the subsequent request that I not teach anymore came because I was radicalized. This is a radical. I ask people what it is in college classrooms. I put this up on the board and I ask them what this is, and they say it's a square root symbol. That's what it does. That's its function. It takes the root, and in this case the square root. It is called a radical because it gets to the root. And that's what radicalism is. That's what radicals do, is get to the root. I was radicalized from very early in my life when I, with great hubris, announced to my high school graduating class that you too can be a nonconformist if required to reach a goal. So I was promoting something beyond the so-called mainstream from a very early age. Among the ideas I was teaching early in my university career were the lies the culture tells us. Don't get me wrong. Nobody in this culture would come up to somebody or say in a classroom or write in a newspaper any of these. Rather, they're just unquestioned assumptions. Nobody's going to go around saying that humans are superior. We just refer to all non-human animals as lower animals or lesser animals. We don't actually say they're inferior. We just use language that makes it obvious that we don't need to make the statement. Similarly, we never say that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet because it's immediately recognized as absurd. We don't need to say it. We just act as if it's true. With a positive discount rate or interest rate given by your bank, that's the assumption. Money will be worth less in the future than it's worth today. This assumes infinite growth on a finite planet. We're always told, or it's assumed, that more is better. In fact, this one is actually spoken out loud with every action we take. More is better, and future generations will always have more, therefore future generations will always have it better than previous generations. One of the things this culture and other civilizations does is monetize everything. When I was speaking in New Zealand late last year, air from New Zealand was being sold in tin cans in Beijing for 85 cents a breath. That good New Zealand air goes for 85 cents a breath. You think breathing is free? You think water is free? You think food is free? Those things all used to be free. And then the first civilizations arose a few thousand years ago, a half a dozen or so of them, simultaneously, when the global average temperature rose above ice age, stabilized at 1.5 degrees above ice age temperature, about 13.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature, stabilized there, and thereby allowed for the growing of grains. And once you can grow grains, you can control the food supply. You can store grains. And once you can control the food supply, you can control the human population as well. Then you can monetize the food. From there, it's an easy step to monetizing everything else, including all life on Earth. So we drive to extinction about 200 species every day because we don't value those species. They aren't us. We frequently hear this one, and people do speak it out loud or put it on their placards. Hope is unimpeachably good. There's nothing, what could possibly be wrong with hope? Well, hope is wishful thinking. Hope is wishing for an outcome over which we have no agency. Hope is the other side of the coin that has fear on the one side. We're going to fear that the situation in the future will be bad. We don't take any action about it. We hope that things will turn out for the best, but we don't take any action about it. We just hope, we just fear, we wishfully think, we ponder the horrors, and we sit, deer in the headlights style. This civilization, like all others, is characterized by endemic racism, endemic misogyny, and endemic monetary disparity leading to poverty. And yet a little over 100 days ago, the United States selected a president who is openly misogynistic, openly racist, and is the pinnacle of wealth in a wealth-pursuing culture. And my friends in the United States are stunned that such a person would be elected president to represent among the most racist, misogynistic, greedy, money-grubbing cultures in the history of the world. Daniel Dennett was talking about religions, and so am I. I'm talking about the religion that is culture, not the religion that is found in any particular church. And Dennett said there's simply no polite way to tell people they dedicated their lives to an illusion. When I point out things like this, it seems that we are living a lie, that this culture is based upon a series of illusions. I could cover the science for this presentation in 3 slides, or maybe even just this one, in which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with their vaunted 5th assessment officially released in 2014, but heavily leaked beginning in September 2013, and pointing out that climate change is irreversible. Think about that for a minute. It's irreversible. That means it can't be reversed. It cannot be turned around. We have entered an abrupt period of heating of the planet in the absence of massive geoengineering of the atmosphere's chemistry. A series of strategies referred to by Truthout as fantasy technology. Finally, the scientists caught up, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and a few months later, a European body of similar stature concluding that geoengineering is not going to work. After all, civilization is a heat engine, as we've known since Tim Garrett published his first paper in 2009, Climatic Change. A paper so important that it was immediately attacked by other climate scientists, removed from its online presence for a year and a half until 2 other research groups were allowed to attack the paper, and Tim Garrett was not allowed a response. But they never questioned the idea that civilization is a heat engine, or that we could do anything about it through civilized means. Ultimately, in other words, civilization, this set of living arrangements, culture, whatever you want to call it, is an omnicidal heat engine. We drive to extinction 200 species a day. I'm not suggesting that you and I are particularly guilty. I'm not suggesting we feel shame or remorse or guilt about any of this. We were all born into captivity. We happen to appear at a certain time in planetary history at a certain privileged location. I didn't choose that. I suspect you didn't either. And yet here we are, contributing to becoming part of this life-destroying set of living arrangements that is also overheating the planet. As soon as I figured this out, I began looking for an off-grid homestead so that I could step away from the civilized life. It was unclear at this point, when I started the search in early 2005, it was unclear that civilization itself was a heat engine, but I knew it was responsible for killing every non-human species on the planet as quickly as possible. So I tried to step away. I established a homestead of 2.7 acres in New Mexico that I refer to as the Mud Hut, with an off-grid structure, well insulated, and I created a biochar kiln and started growing vegetables and cooking with the sun and raising goats for milk and cheese and preserving food and on, had a big orchard and lots of gardens and so on. Because I assumed that if a 49-year-old professor of considerable privilege was willing to walk away from that privilege because civilization is destroying everything, then other people naturally would follow. And within a year or so, we'd have an entire society living off-grid. Yes, I really thought this. It seems kind of ridiculous now. It's a joke even. Well, the joke was on me. As it turns out, not a lot of people thought this was a good idea, so they kept going. And who can blame them? If I had it to do over again, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't. Because in the process of walking away from imperialism, I lost everything in my life. That's a tough thing to do, to give up, everything. In a blog post by Sam Carana, a man who is wise enough, unlike me, to not use his real name so that he can actually keep his job, Sam Carana posits a global temperature rise of more than 10 degrees Celsius above baseline over the course of the next decade. That was last July, middle of last July, so we have about 9 years left in his timeline. And that would take us to this yellow line here, higher than the temperature experienced by Earth at any time in the last 2 billion years. You see that over the course of the last 2 billion years, there have been essentially two stable temperature states for the planet. Ice age, about 12 degrees Celsius, and a hothouse, about 22 degrees Celsius. And this is far and away the most stable, 22 degrees. And then occasionally there will be a little hiccup over the course of the last 2 billion years, in which the temperature will stabilize for a relatively short period of time. And that's been the case here as well. We've been at about 13.5 degrees Celsius for roughly 10,000 years, with a stable, relatively cool temperature closer to ice age than hothouse. Where we're headed, according to Carana, is higher than the temperature that occurred during the Great Dying 252.2 million years ago, when the planetary temperature went up to 23 degrees Celsius. We're going to go higher than that much faster than this event occurred, within 10 years, as opposed to the roughly 900 to roughly 19,000 years during which this occurred. As the grandfather of climate science, James Hansen, points out in a legal brief from about 2 years ago, we've only had humans on the planet at 2 degrees Celsius above baseline. That's right here. And I've drawn in the time over which we've had Homo sapiens on the planet. If this looks like a relatively short period of time compared to 2 billion years, or the 13.8 billion years of the universe, that's because it is a short period of time. It's a stunningly short period of time. If the 13.8 billion year approach, he assumes only a 0.3 degree global average temperature rise over the course of the next decade from what he calls further feedbacks. I've identified more than 5 dozen at guymcpherson.com. So of those further feedbacks, he adds in only 1/3 of a degree Celsius temperature rise from 1750 till the middle of 2016. This is one of those feedbacks that he's talking about, terrestrial permafrost release as permafrost degrades into methane and carbon dioxide. And so I'm going to show here a little clip from about a year ago, published in the Siberian Times. You can find it at siberiantimes.com. So you can play this video clip yourself. It's just a few seconds long, and I want you to listen as the guy's heel goes into the earth for the second time. He's stepping on what used to be permafrost, but now looks like jello or a trampoline. And if you listen very carefully at about the 15-second mark, you can hear pressurized methane and carbon dioxide come out of the ground. This is not normal. You can't hear a thing. Sorry about that. If you could hear, you would hear the roar of the wind over the microphone. And I would encourage you to go to the Siberian Times essay at siberiantimes.com from the 20th of July last year. And when he sticks his heel in this time, the second time, you can see a little gap open up right there. And you can hear a distinctive hissing as pressurized methane and carbon dioxide come spewing out of what used to be permafrost, very solid material, and has become, instead, a lot more like jello. Sorry for the lack of audio. Here we are in 2017, and we not only have Stone Age brains, seems like every time I show up at a presentation we have Stone Age technology. Except for the lights. The lights are awesome. Okay, and other things. This has been our mentality my whole life. The kids will adapt. And this is what Serena Raphael is so irritated about. Her entire millennial generation is getting dumped on. And her generation is supposed to fix it. Fix the unfixable. And most notably, using the tools that have been created that have contributed to the unfixable mess. Reversing irreversible climate change is just one of the many predicaments the millennials are expected to repair so that we can have a few dollars more. Taking that very conservative approach, I get us to right here, hothouse Earth, in a 9-year period of time. If instead of taking that very conservative approach and relying upon the referee journal literature in a couple of places, it turns out Carana is more conservative than the very conservative referee journal literature. If I defer to the referee journal literature, I get us up there to 23 degrees C, at least an order of magnitude faster than it happened 252.2 million years ago, in as little as 9 years from now. When I give the people this message and include the 10-year time frame, everybody I talk to assumes that we have 10 years from this minute. So if I say 10 years, people say, oh, then on May 3rd, 2027, I'm going to die in my sleep. And that's not what I mean. When I first started speaking about abrupt climate change leading to near-term human extinction, it was based upon work indicating an exponential rise in temperature. This is from about 5 years ago, leading to a 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2030. And since at 4C all we can plan for is extinction, I figured, well, at 4C in 2030, we're all gone. In an analysis conducted and posted 9 or 10 days ago, Sam Carana starts using the exponential curve rather than adding up those linear effects, those linear impacts, and coming up with 10 degrees C temperature rise by 2026. And now he comes up with a similar temperature rise within 4 years from now. So here he's looking at exponential rise, as was the case 5 years ago, plotting an exponential curve to the existing data and taking us to 4C above baseline by 2030. Now it looks like we're headed to a much higher temperature than that globally in a much shorter period of time. And this won't come as a big surprise to anybody who's been following my work for a while, because every day I look at the situation, it's worse than the day before. We have more data coming in all the time, indicating the situation is far worse than it was last week or the week before. So, I'm not suggesting we have 10 years. I'm not suggesting we have 4 years. I'm suggesting that time is short. It could very well be that within an ice-free Arctic likely to occur this summer, and almost certain by summer of 2019, after all, it was U.S. Naval Postgraduate College analysis that concluded we would have an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. I'd say we've dodged a bullet 4 years in a row, but that we're headed there pretty quickly. And I don't see how, with an ice-free Arctic, we can avoid the release of 50 gigatons of methane hydrates warned about by Natalia Shkova and colleagues at the European Geophysical Union meeting in late 2008, that they called at the time highly possible for abrupt release at any time. That was almost 10 years ago. I'm amazed it hasn't happened yet. Shkova went on to lie about this. In 2015, in an interview, she said, "We never stated that a 50 gigaton release in near or distant future." This is a direct quote from the European Geophysical Union meeting abstracts. You can find this online. We never stated. I'm not sure how she defined stated, because this looked like quite the statement to me. This would lead to an additional 1.3 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise that would take us well beyond the point at which humans have persisted in the past and would virtually guarantee the demise of industrial civilization, because we wouldn't have habitat requisite to growing grains. And grains form the basis for every civilization so far, including the current one. So if we can't grow grains, that means we can't store food, which means we can't get through the hard times. And we lost about 1/5 of the nation's wheat crop last weekend with a mild winter followed by hail and snow too late in the year in western Kansas. 20% of the wheat crop, boom, in a weekend. This is wet weather weirding. This is abrupt climate change in action. And these are the consequences that are already playing out and that will persist into the future. So, because of a potential abrupt release in methane, and it wouldn't have to be this high to destroy civilization. Civilization probably is destroyed at 2°C above baseline. That's the conservative conclusion reached by most climate scientists. And to get to 2, we only have to have less than half of this release. And then, when civilization goes away because of the lack of global dimming or the aerosol masking effect, we would experience another approximately 3 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise. So now we're at 6, with 3/4 of that temperature rise coming in a span of a few months. I don't see any way that we'll have a tree on the planet when that happens, because trees can't pick up their roots and move along. Neither can any other plants, for that matter. It's not as if we weren't warned. In 1989, late June in fact, Noel Brown, the director of the United Nations Office of the United Nations Environment Program, says we have 10 years to solve the so-called carbon problem before the situation goes beyond human control. That was 38 years ago. We didn't solve anything in a 10-year period of time. We made everything worse. Just over a year later, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases pointed out that the absolute upper limit, the Rubicon we could not cross, was 1 degree Celsius above baseline. Baseline meaning the 1750 baseline, when it was 13.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise. The United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases predicted self-reinforcing feedback loops if we got up to 1 degree C. That's what rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses, or exponential responses, that's what those are. Those are positive feedbacks or self-reinforcing feedback loops. And they nailed this one. They pointed out, and it's implied in this single sentence, that we aren't all going to die because we aren't clever. We are perfectly capable of handling wide swings in temperature variation ourselves. We get into an air-conditioned car, we go in, if it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit outside, it's 68 degrees inside, it's no problem. But we rely upon a delicate and complex web of non-human life for our own persistence. So if we have these self-reinforcing feedback loops that lead to extensive ecosystem damage, like the Dust Bowl that never ends, like the demise of plants so that the livestock have no food, then we aren't going to have any food either. And that's the issue here, is habitat. We are human animals, and as such we depend upon many other species for our own existence, for our own persistence. And without habitat, even our favorite species doesn't persist. David Spratt, climate writer and speaker, concluded just about 2.5 years ago that 1 degree C was probably ridiculously liberal, and that really we should have been looking at about 0.5 degree C, which I think we passed in 1976. So that was the Rubicon we actually could not cross, and we crossed it a long time ago. Our response to this dire situation is to keep looking at our precious digital devices while we step off the cliff. Unless you think I'm not guilty, that's me right there. In addition to climate change as an outcome of this culture, we also have another outcome of this culture. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. You gotta love the way scientists describe the situation by title. Accelerated modern human-induced species losses. Can't we just say it? 6th mass extinction underway? Entering the 6th mass extinction, this one caused by humans. That's what that title should say. According to the senior author of that paper, which came out a couple of years ago, in an interview, Ceballos stated that life would take many millions of years to recover, and of course it would, because after the 5 previous mass extinction events in planetary history, it took several million years for the planet to become verdant and vibrant again. So of course it would take several million years to recover, and our species itself would likely disappear early on. Turns out he was wrong about that. We've been driving to extinction a couple hundred species every day since at least 2010, when the United Nations report came out in August. And so we aren't among the first species to disappear. But he was pointing out, as a conservation biologist, that we depend upon many other species for our own survival, and as such, by driving all those other species to extinction, we're going to die too. Most complex life on the planet went extinct during the Great Dying 252.2 million years ago, and we are incredibly complex life. We are not single-celled. We act like it sometimes, but we are not bacteria. We are not microbes. We are not fungi. We are complex organisms comprised of hundreds of organisms ourselves. In this body I call me are a whole bunch of bacteria and microbes that I'm really not in charge of. I do have good news. I'm like a Hollywood movie. I wouldn't leave you without the good news. We do get to die. Sometimes I say that in such a way that makes people think that isn't good news. But in fact, what it means is we get to live, as Snoopy points out to Charlie Brown by Charles Schulz's cartoon here. We actually get to live. It's amazing. We know a lot about DNA. We know a lot about the universe we inhabit. We know how many atoms there are, more or less, in the universe. Imagine that. It's not like scientists counted, because that would take too long. But we have a pretty good estimate of how many atoms there are in the universe. And we know so much about DNA that we know that the odds against any one of us appearing here in physical form exceed the odds against plucking a single atom at random from the entire universe. Wow. And yet here we are. It's as if you buy a lottery ticket, just one every week, and you win every week. You buy one lottery ticket every week, and you win the jackpot every week for the rest of your life. The odds against you being here in physical form far exceed those odds. I'm not suggesting you buy a lottery ticket, just to be clear. I'm suggesting you already won one. You already won the lottery. You get to be here. As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins says, in the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I that are privileged to be here, privileged with eyes to see where we are and brains to wonder why. That's remarkable. No other species on the planet that we're driving to extinction gets to ponder that we are even here, much less why we are here. They don't have the eyes to see and the brains to wonder why. They might have the eyes to see. They don't have the big brains that allow us to ponder our own existence. I'm going to propose some actions. It's just advice. I'm not into shoulding at all. I don't tell people what they should do, and it annoys me when other people tell me what I should do. So I'm just going to give these little tidbits, take them for what they're worth. One thing we could do is remain calm, or if you're not there already, to get calm, because nothing is actually under your control. You think the demise of civilization is up to you? You think the continuation of civilization is up to you? You think the death of your 89-year-old grandmother is up to you? Probably not. The exception here is that there are a few things under our control as individuals, and they have to do with the people we interact with on a regular basis. So, if your son turned 21 years old today, for example, then you might be able to contribute to their well-being by taking them out for, say, their first legal drink. Instead of telling them that you really shouldn't drink, son. You know, you're only 21 and you're not really in control of your own life. You probably shouldn't do that. Or you can just be mean to them and not even bring it up at all. So we do have some control over the individuals in our lives and how they feel. Although mostly how they feel is a response to how they're treated. Anyway, we could remain calm. We could pursue excellence in a culture of mediocrity, and that will be bizarre and completely unrewarded externally. But then you get to look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and conclude that maybe you had not a bad day after all. The pursuit of excellence in a culture of mediocrity such as this one will only bring insults and disparagement. Maybe you'll lose your job. Excellence is not encouraged. The Peter Principle applies here. And third, the pursuit of love, the pursuit of excellence and love, however you define those, and I'm not going to define them for you because hopefully you can look them up in your own dictionary, even if that's the one in your brain, that tells you what it means to be an excellent human being, tells you what it means to love somebody or something and the entire planet. I was coming through an airport on the way here and I saw an advertisement for something. The slogan is so good, I forgot what they were advertising. The slogan said, there are 7 days in the week and some day is not one of them. I think they were promoting travel or something, you know, but the bottom line is some day is not one of the days you have left. Do it now. If you love it, if it's an excellent thing, do it now. Don't wait for someday. Someday never comes. There's more. Another way you might find your life improved is if you act more like your dog and less like you. No offense. There's a reason your dog is happier than you. There's a reason my friend Paul Marcotte is a pet sitter. Because he likes hanging out with animals because they remind him to be in the moment. You take a dog for a walk in the park and the park has 4 trees in the sun. What does the dog see? 4 trees in the sun. And the dog rolls around and thinks it's happy as can be. What do we see when we're walking in the park? Everything except the 4 trees in the sun. We're really not very good, present company included, at noticing what's going on around us and being fully present with it. Maybe if we could do that a little bit better, we might be as happy as our 4-legged friends. Instead, we capitulate to culture, we capitulate to this society, this set of living arrangements, civilization, which tells us how we should all act. that we should go to school, and then we should go to more school, and then we should get married, we should have 2.5 children, and we should work for 40 years, and then we should retire, and then, and only then, do we get to take the time to enjoy the things we always wanted to do. That's what the culture tells us to do. It must be the right thing. I'm suggesting that we throw off some of those shackles, that we don't use the expectations of others, including this culture, as the bars that hold us in the cage. I will acknowledge that we are all born into captivity. We don't have to reinforce the bars, though. We were born into a set of living arrangements. We don't have to double down. We can do the weirdest things. We can dance in the rain, even though it'll attract funny looks. Finally, in the way of action, I'm up to 5 or 6 so far. If you're interested in the science and only the science, you can go to a single essay that I updated repeatedly there at guymcpherson.com/climate-chaos and find out all the evidence you could possibly imagine wanting to know about. You can read more about that in Extinction Dialogues, as well as, according to the subtitle of the book I co-authored with Carolyn Baker, How to Live with Death in Mind. So this integrates the science that was known up to about 2015 and also includes some words of advice about how to live in light of our terminal diagnosis. Yours, mine, and ours. And if you'd like to target youngsters in your life, ages 11 and up, certainly including your 50 and 60-year-old friends. I think we wrote this mostly for the parents of the youngsters. We were hoping the parents would be reading the book too. But this is really an overview of the disaster that we affectionately refer to as civilization and what it costs in terms of non-human species, soil, air, water, food, all of that. In a short overview. So there's some things to read. There's a workshop for people who have reached acceptance of their own demise and want to have the conversation. Because as I indicated earlier, that's a conversation we don't have. There are many, many topics that are taboo in this culture, and death is certainly one of them. We don't talk about death. We don't talk about dying. We don't talk about sex. We don't talk about grief. We don't talk about bodily functions. In other words, anything that's important, we just put it aside and declare it taboo. If you want to have the conversation nobody else is willing to have, this workshop is designed just for you. Do we get off the treadmill? How? What does that mean? What are we doing? What shall I do in the limited time I have left? And I promise that it's limited. In March of 2015, early March of 2015, at her 117th birthday party, the oldest person on the planet at that time was asked to ponder those first 117 years of her life. And in response, she said, and I quote, "It seemed rather short." She was 117 years old. It seemed rather short. You don't have that long. It will seem rather short. To put a punctuation mark on her message, and apparently mine, she died a few weeks later. And it seemed rather short. What are you going to do with your terminal diagnosis? That's the only real question I have today. Thank you for tolerating me asking it in so many different forms and with so many personal stories. I'll take as much time as you want for questions. I'll stay here until I think we have the room for another nearly an hour. So we can stay here and chat. We can get a little circle. We can do whatever you want. Yes? 55 people online,
and they might want to ask questions.
Those 55 people online are welcome to ask questions. And I'll go out there on campus and find somebody who can answer it for them. I'm just sure this is a learned place.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you've done a lot of research and have done some peer-reviewed papers. Could you maybe explain how you get from doing field research to getting to the point of getting a paper published? Maybe in short.
Yeah. No, that's a fine question. Most people don't understand what a peer-reviewed paper even means. What does that term mean? It just rolls off my tongue because I've been talking about it for my entire adult life. But what does that mean? Well, you have an idea. As a field biologist, you have an idea. I think that if as the models predict, the precipitation where I live is going to become less bimodal, less a bunch of summer monsoon and some winter rain, less like that, and it's going to be less rain altogether in the summer and more rain in the winter. That's the idea. So I'm a field biologist, and I actually asked that question many years ago. So I thought about how to answer that question, and I ended up manipulating the precipitation regime by putting rainout shelters over a bunch of large areas, adding water and subtracting water at various seasons to simulate what would happen with a 50% increase or a 50% decrease in the amount of precipitation received during an entire season, and then evaluated how the plants grew. What happened with the soil? So it was about a year from the time of the idea until the funding came through. And then it was another 4 years collecting the data. And then it was another couple of years publishing the paper. So only about 7 years after the idea, because it was fast-tracked, we had some information about what that really meant, 7 years. I should point out that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in each of their assessments, uses only peer-reviewed journal literature. So, in other words, they rely upon information that is at least 5 years old. That's the cutoff. It's, by its nature, very conservative. And then the results are vetted through the political process and censored by the political process, so that it becomes even more conservative. The primary character one must exhibit to have papers published in the refereed journal literature, and I've had dozens, the primary character one must have is persistence. It's hard work. You actually have to collect the data. It has to be a meaningful question or series of questions before you even get the funding to start. And then it goes through a rigorous process of peer review by which your peers in the sciences review the paper blindly, so you don't even know who they are. They give you feedback. 90% of the time in the journals, the papers I'm talking about now by way of example, 90% of the time the papers are rejected outright by those journals. It's not good enough. So 2 of the papers published based on the scenario I described were published in Ecology and Ecological Monographs, 2 of the leading journals in the ecological sciences. And it took years, and a lot of persistence, and a lot of money, and thousands of hours in the field collecting data. Thousands of hours. It's not like people write up these refereed journal articles because they thought of something in the shower and then wrote it down in the kitchen on the way to teach a class and then sent it on that piece of paper to the journal. It's a very rigorous process that leads to a very conservative outcome. It's tough. Most faculty members never publish one. Never publish one. Most tenure-track faculty do publish or they don't get tenure. But it's very rare for even tenure-track faculty to produce a book, a synthesis of their scholarship. So that's very rare for somebody to synthesize. It's hard work. It's all hard work along the way. And it leads to a very conservative outcome as a consequence. The arts are better. They're more relevant, they're more timely, and they tend to be equally accurate, if not more so. I should have done cartoons for my life. There's a question online?
There's a couple.
Hit me with them.
All right. First one comes from our good friend
We don't have to name names.
in California.
Mm-hmm.
What made weather settle down to enable agriculture to start? You
So
wanna repeat?
the primary character one must exhibit to have papers published in the refereed journal literature, and I've had dozens, the primary character one must have is persistence. It's hard work. You actually have to collect the data. It has to be a meaningful question or series of questions before you even get the funding to start. And then it goes through a rigorous process of peer review by which your peers in the sciences review the paper blindly, so you don't even know who they are. They give you feedback. 90% of the time in the journals, the papers I'm talking about now by way of example, 90% of the time the papers are rejected outright by those journals. It's not good enough. So 2 of the papers published based on the scenario I described were published in Ecology and Ecological Monographs, 2 of the leading journals in the ecological sciences. And it took years and a lot of persistence and a lot of money and thousands of hours in the field collecting data. Thousands of hours. It's not like people write up these referee journal articles because they thought of something in the shower and then wrote it down in the kitchen on the way to teach a class and then sent it on that piece of paper to the journal. It's a very rigorous process that leads to a very conservative outcome. It's tough. Most faculty members never publish one. Never publish one. Most tenure-track faculty do publish or they don't get tenure. But it's very rare for even tenure-track faculty to produce a book, a synthesis of their scholarship. So that's very rare for somebody to synthesize. It's hard work. It's all hard work along the way. And it leads to a very conservative outcome as a consequence. The arts are better. They're more relevant, they're more timely, and they tend to be equally accurate, if not more so. I should have done cartoons for my life. There's a question online.
There's a couple.
Hit me with them.
All right. First one comes from our good friend
We don't have to name names.
in California.
Mm-hmm.
What made weather settle down to enable agriculture to start? You
So,
want to repeat
yeah, that point. And stayed at that temperature, 13.5 degrees Celsius, global average temperature, for a couple thousand years. And when that happened, the soils were right, the precipitation regime was right, the temperature was right, so that grains could be grown, most notably maize or corn, but also wheat and oats, and all those grains that you find in all those whole grain cereals and breads and so on. 2 things happened there. The temperature raised above ice age and stabilized for a long period of time. I was going to try to show an example, but apparently I'm inept. So the temperature raised above ice age by 1.5 degrees above ice age, and it stabilized for a couple of thousand years. Those 2 are critical. It has to be relatively cool because look at where grains are grown today. They're grown in the interior of large continents, mostly in the northern hemisphere, where it's pretty cool, especially during the winter. Those grains are grown in seasonal climates. They aren't grown in tropical climates, where the temperature is warm to hot year-round. They aren't grown in Antarctica or in the Arctic, where the temperature is cold year-round. They're grown in seasonal climates, where the climate has stabilized for an extended period of time. So 2 critical factors there. Temperature rise to 1.5 degrees above ice age, and then stability at that point. Both are crucial. Now we're going beyond the point at which grains have ever been grown in history so far. And we see the example from last weekend of a single storm wiping out about 20% of the nation's wheat crop in a weekend. It's that instability that has never been developed to shade the planet. And what do I think about it? Well, I think doing is what got us here. I think that our constant desire to geoengineer the planet through farming and other means, is responsible for anthropogenic climate change and ultimately for abrupt climate change that has now spun out of human control. So I'm not sure that humans doing would be nearly as good as an idea as human beings at this point. That said, we are very attached to ourselves. We really like ourselves. As individuals, as a civilization, as a species, nobody loves us more than we do. And so it does not surprise me that some folks at Harvard, for example, want to test geoengineering strategies, even though two synthes of that idea have been conducted one by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and another by a group of similar stature in Europe, indicating that geoengineering is not going to work. I'm still not surprised that it's going to be attempted. Desperate times call for desperate measures and all that. And we don't really know, do we? We don't know. We can be really, really certain at this point, based on the very conservative journal literature, that we're headed for human demise in the near term. I'm certain of that. I'm also fairly certain that if we tried to fix it or turn it around, it would make matters worse. But we don't know for sure. So who am I to tell people what can't be done? In fact, it's one of the things I learned early on in my college teaching career. Students kept coming up to me with the assignment of a special project. And I wouldn't give them any guidelines on what they ought to do for this special project because I want them to be creative. And so then they'd come up to me and they'd say, I decided that for my special project I'm going to do this, this, and this. And I would just go something like this. Are you kidding me? That's impossible. 37 researchers tried that over the course of the last 100 years and it just doesn't work. Don't be so ridiculous. And then that student would go out and do it. And so I learned within a couple of years to stop telling people what they can't do. So maybe we can do this. I'd be very surprised. But maybe, and I'm sure not going to stand in anybody's way who wants to improve the situation for life on Earth.
What do you know and what can you say about the Milankovitch cycles and how they play into seasonal and climate variation over long periods of time?
What do I know and what can I say about the Milankovitch cycles and how they play into climate fluctuations over time, over long periods of time? Well, I know very little, especially off the top of my head, whereas that usually doesn't stop me from saying a lot. It is going to work this time. There's a lot known about the Milankovitch cycles, the notion that they come along every, 100 and some thousand years, and that wobble that is responsible for the cooling of the planet that takes us into an ice age and back out, in addition to the carbon release from the ocean. So, but there's lots of sources better than me to find that information. And we have these amazing digital devices that allow us to do anything, almost anything. I mean, if you want to create the absolute horrors of the planet in as quick a time as possible, you could do a lot worse than marketing these things. But what they also allow us to do is find out information just like that in a matter of seconds. Milankovitch, that's with a K. So I won't say any more because we do know a lot about these physical processes. And that's really a physical process. The Earth and how it rotates and when a wobble comes along and how frequently that wobble comes along and what it does in terms of the overall temperature of the planet. Those are pretty easy things to study, actually. Way, way easier, orders of magnitude easier to study physical processes than to study chemical processes, much less biological processes. So how do organisms respond? That's a very, very complex issue relative to the Milankovitch cycle, for example. Great question. Sorry, I don't know more about it. The Google knows. No endorsement intended. Yes?
In your opinion, how do you see the civilizations, specifically human beings, reacting to when climate change is apparent?
It's not apparent yet.
Well,
How
Those
do
who are in denial.
how do I foresee civilization and human beings within civilization responding to climate change when it becomes apparent? More apparent. Okay. You know, it's already very, very apparent for people who are losing habitat, and they are many. You can move to New Zealand from the United States if you have one of a handful of very little known skills. That'll be enough to get you into New Zealand, or you can pay $2 million US. Those are the two ways to escape to New Zealand, where you might live a few months longer than if you live in Missouri, for example, in light of abrupt climate change. Or you can be one of the few people in the South Pacific who have lost habitat during the last 3 years and therefore are moving off of their islands and are being taken in by New Zealand as climate change refugees. $2 million or global average or sea level rise in the South Pacific causing loss of habitat, and you become a refugee. It's an interesting response and a magnanimous one in New Zealand relative to 2 years ago I was touring Western Europe, and the Western Europeans, like all other civilizations, are characterized by people with a certain level of racism, but it really became obvious when climate refugees from the Middle East and Northern Africa were leaving in droves and going to Western Europe. They didn't want to leave. In many cases, these people were living in the same place that their family had been for generations, for many generations, in Middle East and Northern Africa. But they could no longer grow food. And so they were fleeing to someplace else. And they were not welcome in Western Europe by most people there. It was full. How are people going to behave? They're going to flee. They're going to try to go to places where they're not welcome. And that's going to increase the conflict on the planet. Garrett Hardin wrote about this 40 years ago in his essay, Living on a Lifeboat, and also in his essay, Tragedy of the Commons. And that's where we are. It's being pushed by climate change, exacerbated by too many people on too small a planet to grow food for everybody, but we're already there. In the future, humans will exhibit all the behaviors they already exhibit. They will become even worse humans than they already are. People will kill people for a few dimes or for a few minutes longer on the planet. And other humans will become the kindest, most compassionate individuals we could possibly imagine. I predict that all human behaviors will be exacerbated as things become increasingly difficult in the future. That some people's compassion will come out, and their love, and their ability to love other people, and to make sacrifices on their own. But for other people, the opposite will be true. We can't predict the future with certainty, not as it involves our own lives. But we can make the future, especially as it involves our own lives. So I find that inspiring. I'm not afraid of how people are going to act in the future because I know I was born with a terminal diagnosis. And what I have control over is me and how I respond to situations. And I'm not even sure, in light of the near absence of free will, that I have a lot of control over that. But I'll give that my shot anyway and try to become a more decent human being as things spiral beyond human control even more.
So I was wondering if perhaps that this 50 gigaton burst of methane is actually in the process of going, and it's not going to be this like overnight thing that people think, oh, it's going to go kaboom and then it's all going to change. But I think it seems like that 50 gigatons or however many gigatons comes out is already started, and it's just going to keep progressing down the line. that? Because, I mean, we're looking at huge methane spikes in the northern hemisphere right now, where it hasn't been, like, what's 2,800 something parts per billion now? And to me, it seems like it's actually in the midst of happening, rather than we're waiting for it to happen. It's happening.
Yes, it could very well be that the 50 gigaton burst or its equivalent in not quite a burst, but more of a slow leak. Could be that's already underway. You know, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the parts per billion of methane in the atmosphere was about 750 parts per billion. And as nearly as we can tell in all of human history, it never exceeded 750 parts per billion until the Industrial Revolution, and now it's well over 2,000 parts per billion. It's well over 250% of what it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's underway. We have observed and are observing exponential rise of methane in the atmosphere. To claim otherwise is to deny the data at this point. And of course it's getting worse with the spikes that we're seeing at various times during the year, as you indicated, up to nearly 3,000 parts per billion. Now, methane is at least 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. At least 100 times more powerful in the short term, meaning a decade or so. So 2,800 parts per billion is the equivalent of 2.8 parts per million, which is the equivalent of at least 280 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if you just add together the 412 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the at least 200 parts per million equivalent from methane alone, just those two greenhouse gases have us at more than 600 parts per million equivalent of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there's a handful of other greenhouse gases as well. If 350 was safe, and it wasn't, James Hansen said 300 was safe, that 350 was the absolute upper limit, and now we're at the equivalent of more than 600, I think we might be in trouble. I think it's time we recognize that the train left the station. No, the train didn't leave the station. The train fell off the trestle already and is plunging 750 feet down to the bottom, and we're arguing about who gets the better seat on the way down. But we're all going down, we're all in the train, and it's going to crash. The thing is, it's not the fall that kills you. It's the abrupt stop at the bottom. So you can deny the fall all the way down until the abrupt stop at the bottom. And that's what we see going on right now.
Yeah, I was in Oregon for the last few months over the winter time, and we were awash in this thing that they kept calling the atmospheric river. And it was like a river kept coming down on us. We had snow, we had rain, and we had the snowiest, wettest winter in Oregon in many years.
Yeah, you bring up an important right. You bring up an important point. We're hearing terms now that were not in the vernacular at all ever, and now they're commonplace. We started with haboobs. Strictly from a meteorological perspective, those don't happen in the northern hemisphere, except now they happen every year around Phoenix, Arizona. We have rain bombs. We have what is the well, we have atmospheric rivers, and we have the hay fever. What is that thing called? Asthma, thunderstorm asthma. Thunderstorm asthma. Okay, so these are terms that didn't exist 5 years ago, and now they're every day in the news. And the meteorologist is talking about, oh, what a nice, lovely day it is. And they'd never mentioned climate change, much less abrupt climate change. It's all just beautiful now, except when it's not. And then we call it a rain bomb. Oh, what a bummer for you people in Missouri. Jesus, too bad the floods are 13 feet above flood stage. That's a bummer. We need to get that fixed so that next year that doesn't happen. Yes, that's my response. Yeah.
Do I understand that Antarctica is melting from the bottom?
That's what I understand, yes.
I mean, they're just kind of somewhat lately.
Yeah. Yeah, within the last few years, it's been documented that Greenland, Antarctica, and the Arctic, the ice is melting from below as well as from the surface. And this is relatively new among the scientific community. It's something that people thought about a long time ago, but it's never actually going to happen. Or if it does, it's going to start in 2100, the magic date for everything. But yes, we are now seeing that it's not just warm air that is causing the loss of Antarctic ice, and that's land ice, not floating ice like is in the Arctic. But it's also being greased from below, just like the rivers below the glaciers in Greenland. And once you have warm water, meaning not frozen water, rubbing up against ice, that's going to melt that ice really, really fast.
It's 15 degrees Celsius warmer in Greenland this week than it should be. 15 degrees Celsius.
15 degrees Celsius. That's 2.8 times 15 is 30 plus about 10. So about 40 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal. That's a big number.
Is it close to 0 C? Or what's the actual temp?
The actual temp, I don't know, but it was like they showed a map with the colors of the northern hemisphere. It was all color coded, you know, with the white being the hottest and going out to like greens and blues being cooler. And Greenland was the hottest place in the northern hemisphere, according to the temperature above normal, you know, anomaly.
What I heard was above freezing in Greenland,
Yeah, oh, it's definitely above freezing.
from
Yeah.
May 3rd to May 5th.
Well, it looked like the jet stream, I've been watching it this week with all this weather. Looks like it's going all the way up, all the way across Greenland. A couple days ago, it was almost down to Panama. It's, you know, on the bottom, on the southern end of it, it's scooted up some now, but it's amazing, you know, the wobble, the wave is and everything.
Yeah, but there was snow in western Kansas, so climate change isn't real. Just to be clear.
Well, this
I
is
don't want
not-
you people to be alarming people.
This is not a pause, you mean?
Right?
Right. No pause
Yeah,
intended.
The thing with the melting beneath, I mean, Greenland is basically like a bowl. So there's these mountains around the edges and then it sinks down into a valley. And so the that ice sheet is being held on, has been being held on by the sea ice, kind of holding it in. And then with it melting and all these different moulins and everything, the glaciers are just rushing out to sea now. And because of this lubrication from underneath, in the past when Greenland melted off, they had these huge events called Heinrich events, where the ice sheet would break off in these huge pieces and just leave Greenland in mass. And there are still records of how they scoured the sea bottom. They scraped along the sea bottom as they were leaving. And so there's a group of people who are sort of monitoring Greenland now because of this melting from above and below. They're anticipating a Heinrich event happening again in the future as the ice sheet breaks apart and leaves Greenland and goes out to sea.
Yeah, the sea rise is something that the new scientists, Mann and Hansen focus on, and they seem to be more worried about that than temperature rise, whereas temperature rise are to do us in quickly, and they seem to fixate on sea rise, when in fact that's what we're looking at, even decades for a slight sea rise, maybe hundreds of years for, who knows, I don't know how fast it's gonna happen, but it's still less than temperature rise, which is, it could destroy all habitat, you know, so I just don't understand, they know that.
Right. Well, I think it kind of
Well-
goes in, the temperature rise and the sea level rise are hand in hand, because when you have more water and you have the thermal expansion of the water, you have more vicious storms, you have more water in the
Well,
atmosphere.
the biggest
It's like
water
there's-
coming from evaporation.
Right.
There's incredible evaporation going on mainly around the polar, the equator, because there's no clouds,
Right.
and that's where
I
the
know.
moisture's coming from.
Well, I certainly agree that there's a very sharp focus on sea level rise. And I think there's a good reason for that. It's an easy metric to measure. Like temperature, it's an easy metric to measure. And on Earth, it's way easier to measure temperature. It's way easier to measure sea level rise than it is to measure global average temperature. So temperature locally is easy to measure. But globally, sea level is used as a measure, so it's commonly used as an indicator or a metric of how dire the climate change situation is. And I agree that it has received far too much attention from folks like Michael Mann and James Hansen, as you mentioned. And I'm not surprised, because they're not biologists. They're not biologists. They study space science, they study astronomy, they study physics. Those are easy things to study, so if you want to look for an easy metric, you look at gravity, 9.8 feet per second per second. You know, those things that hold up over every situation. So I think it's easy to focus on those easier things, especially if you're promulgating the message that we can still fix this, that we can use the tools created by the predicament to overcome the predicament that is civilization. So, of course, Hansen and Mann are not going to focus on habitat. I think they don't know much about it, and it's a sketchy thing that we don't understand. And they think, look, we put people in space. They're in the International Space Station. They're living at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. Humans are so clever we can live anywhere. Habitat, schmabitat. That's my response. Right, when I'm being polite. Yeah, habitat's tough. It's tough to measure. It's tough to evaluate. You know, wildlife biologists, conservation biologists have been trying to measure habitat for 100+ years and reduce it to a single number. It's all but impossible. So it's way easier to measure the easy things. But remember what Einstein said, not all that is counted counts, and all that counts is counted. And that's where we are with respect to climate change. We're measuring a bunch of stuff that maybe isn't the most important stuff because we can't measure the things that really matter. We don't have the tools. We can measure, we can estimate how many species were disappearing. We know where it all results from, don't we? We know that every one of these challenges, we'll call them, is rooted in civilization. Fouling the air, dirtying the water, eroding the soils, driving species to extinction, overheating the planet, endemic racism, endemic monetary disparity, endemic misogyny. Where do they come from? They come in every civilization. That might be a clue. So we dance around it. Dancing to our own demise. Anybody out there in the cyber world have more questions?
Somebody wants to know, what do you do that you love? What do you do to fulfill your quest for excellence in life?
So this is a personal question? What do I do in pursuit of love and in pursuit of excellence? Well, I live outside of the United States because I didn't love living in the United States for a long time. You know, I heard for at least the last 20 years I was living in the United States, I heard love it or leave it, because I was very critical of the country I was living in. It was the country of my birth, it was the only country I really knew, and I didn't like it. I didn't like what was happening. I liked a lot of things about this country. I'm with Edward Abbey on this one. A patriot must be prepared to defend his country against his government. I love the country. I don't love the politics. I don't like what this set of living arrangements has become in the United States. I don't love the endemic misogyny and the endemic racism and the endemic monetary disparity and the overwhelming, unrelenting pursuit for another dollar at the expense of every single being on the planet. I hate all those things, so I left because I love living outside the United States. I love pursuing a different way of living. In my case, agrarian anarchism, as opposed to unfettered disaster capitalism. I love being surrounded by people who look different from me and who act different from me. I live in what I think is among the most multicultural places on earth. There is no ethnic majority in the country of Belize. I live on a property with half a dozen adults. One born in Nigeria, raised in Greece. The others all a few shades darker than me. And from heritages that range from Creole to what we might call Hispanic to what we might call African for their roots. And that's just emblematic, characteristic of the entire country. Yes, there are a few expats. Apparently most of them are retired CIA. I don't appreciate that part nearly as much as maybe I could. But there's also a sweet, tough nature to the people who are not, for the most part, interested in making another dollar at the expense of the planet. There's a simpler way of living rooted in agrarian anarchism there that I don't see in this country, and I don't envision ever seeing in this country. So there's all kinds of things I like about living where I live. The internet is not one of them. There are a few other things. But that's the nature of the beast, isn't it? I mean, we have enormous privilege, those of us watching out there in cyberspace, almost all of us in the global north, maybe in New Zealand, Australia. We have this enormous privilege. So we actually get to choose, for the most part, where we live and to a certain extent what we do with our time. We're in a position to make that decision, and yet most people remain on the hamster wheel, keep chasing after the next dollar, living as if that dollar is what really matters, living as in a manner similar to everybody around them, instead of challenging this set of living arrangements and choosing to live differently. I'm not sure I answered the question, but I went on for a while, and that gets us to the next question.
Well, maybe you might want to read off and thank the people from all the different countries and cities they're in.
Thank you. Wow. To the people from York in the UK, Chester, England, Perth, Australia, Wellington, New Zealand, Berkeley, California, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Oakland, California, and probably other places as well. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. And we're all here from Missouri and Kansas. From Kansas because misery loves company. Yeah.
So what advice would
That
you
was a
give
joke.
a person who does have to work and cannot just abandon their current lifestyle to pursue their life of excellence? What advice would you give to that individual?
Well, I worked really, really hard and took it all very seriously for way too many years of my life. And I was paid to think. So I really could show up at my office and put my feet up on the desk and talk to people who came in about what I considered to be important topics. I got to pursue a life of leisure in the historical sense. In the historical sense, what that means is doing the work you want to do. A life of leisure is not lying in a hammock all day. It's doing the work you want to do. And I was able to do that. And it got to be too much because it was part of an omnicidal culture. And so I decided to step away. And I realized not everybody has the ability to do that. We all have the ability, in the thousands of decisions we make every day, to make some of them differently. I'm not suggesting everybody give up work or that anybody give up working, doing the work especially if it's work they love or even can tolerate. Because at its root, we all have to have that money, because that's what drives the whole system. That's what allows us to eat every day and have roofs over our heads. But there are many, many acts we can take every day that would demonstrate compassion, or not, for humans and other animals. Do we have to work, and I did this pretty much my entire adult life, do we have to work 16 or 18 hours a day? Or can we work 8 or 10 and spend more time with the people we claim to love? And maybe allow those relationships to persist a little longer and become a little bit more meaningful than they otherwise are. And if you're looking at Exhibit A, if you're looking at me, you're looking at Exhibit A of bad behavior in that respect. My name is Guy, and I'm a workaholic. And it came at enormous cost. I loved the work I was doing. I loved the people I was working with, none of whom are still in my life. Because when I walked away from that life, Everybody just assumed I was insane. Maybe they did before and I just didn't know. Maybe they were right. But we do get to make the decision, don't we? When we come to a place in traffic and we're late for work, we can buzz through the red light or not. We can take our time with people who are having difficulty with their lives, maybe with accepting this message or not. There's a lot of things we can do. And I doubt many of us have to work at the job we're working at with the kind of dedication many of us are showing. Maybe. I don't know your situation. And I'm not shooting anybody into doing anything anyway. But most of us can live differently even if it's for a few minutes every day. Even if it's for a few minutes every day to be grateful for what we have and to express that in some manner. That's way, way, way more radical than anything I was doing for 40 years of my life. Might be worth a thought.
Do you have citizenship there, or residency, or how does that work?
I'm a tourist.
That's because you go in and out frequently enough.
Yeah, I'm a tourist in Belize because in Belize I don't really understand how it works or who has to get paid off to make it work. But I'm pretty sure it costs more money than I have to pay those people off. But to become a resident would require me to not leave more than 2 weeks at a time for an entire year, and the total time there has to be a year, pretty much uninterrupted by departing. And I'm not willing to do that yet. It comes with some benefits, like I wouldn't have to claim to be a citizen of the United States, for example, which is all kinds of benefits accrue, if only psychologically, from that one. And also then I wouldn't have to get my passport stamped every 30 days. There's a whole bunch of other little minor niggling details as well. There's a variety of ways to pursue residency or citizenship. And I know people who are on various tracks there. There's the Qualified Retirement Persons Program, I think it's called, that allows people who have money from almost any place to pretty much buy their way in to a bunch of privileges. I don't have the kind of money it takes to do that, and I'm not sure I would anyway. I don't mind calling myself a tourist. There are worse places, worse names to call yourself than a tourist. So I kind of enjoy not being anchored to one place. That might change at some point, but I suspect I'll be dead by then, so I don't probably have to worry about it. Got anything else there in the world?
Someone just called us the dinosaurs and the asteroids.
Oh yes. I mentioned that on the radio show. It turns out that during the extinction event about 56 million years ago that caused the extinction of the dominant species, dinosaurs, that was triggered by, originally it was thought, for a long time it was thought that was triggered by an asteroid or an interstellar device that struck the Yucatan Peninsula and caused a bunch of stuff to kick up into the atmosphere and cool the planet quite suddenly. So it was one of the 3 mass extinction events that resulted from an abrupt cooling of the planet. We're in the midst of the 3rd abrupt heating event and the 3rd mass extinction resulting from that. But this event 56 million years ago, it was thought for a really, really long time, decades, that resulted from the asteroid kicking the dust into the air and cooling the planet, causing the demise of the dominant life form on the planet, the dinosaurs. Well, recently, like within the last 2 years, the Referee Journal article indicates that it wasn't just the comet striking the planet and kicking dust up into the air. The interstellar body actually struck oil. The asteroid struck oil, lit it all on fire. So there's soot in the air from burning the fire. So we're the asteroid that struck oil and burned it all up and put fossil fuels into the atmosphere. We're also the dominant species. We're the asteroid, we're the dinosaurs. We're all of the above. Isn't that cool? We're that good. We can be the asteroid and the comet. Reminds me of a dinosaur joke. Stand-up comic dinosaur says, "What's our least favorite reindeer?" Comet. Think about that, maybe it'll come to you. We have 3 minutes left in this room. Are there any questions from abroad? If not, we could actually leave on time. All right.
Thank you.
Call it a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Human encyclopedia.
Reminds me of a dinosaur joke. Stand-up comic dinosaur says, "What's our least favorite reindeer?" Comet. Think about that, maybe it'll come to you. We have 3 minutes left in this room. Are there any questions from abroad? If not, we could actually leave on time. All right.
Thank you.
Call it a wrap. Thank you.